Well, good afternoon, everyone. I show that it is 1 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started because I know you're all excited to hear the information that we have to present to you today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Stacy Fox. I'm Executive Director of Events and Education here at TSCRA. We are recording this session for later viewing. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. If you have questions, please drop those into the Q&A box or into the chat box. Really prefer the Q&A, but sometimes the chat is a little easier, and we'll try to manage those, and the speakers have left some time at the end of the session to be able to answer some of those questions. So that's the benefit of getting on here live and not just waiting for the recording, is that you'll have the chance to actually interact with our speakers at the end. This is a virtual version of our Ranching 101 program that's held monthly in our office. So we do still want to thank our sponsor, Lone Star Ag Credit, and I'm going to show a quick video from them. Maybe.
I grew up on a ranch outside Wheeler in the Texas Panhandle. My dad did not believe that girls couldn't do everything boys could do. So I definitely was working cattle. We had pigs that we harvested for meat, and so we were feeding them and taking care of them. And my personality is probably more into marketing, but I knew that I wanted to, my job, my career, my life to be agriculture. My major at Texas Tech was agricultural economics. So Lone Star seemed like a natural fit for me. I am the Assistant Director of Marketing and Communications. I've been with Lone Star for 12 years. So on a day-to-day basis, I work closely with the branches and help support them in their local communities. But I also oversee our marketing and headquarters that covers the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We support a variety of different groups in the Metroplex. We cover the Fort Worth Stock Show, we cover the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Convention, the Dallas Safari Club, the State Fair of Texas. There's a lot of wonderful organizations that we're able to support and sponsor and celebrate who they are and what they do. We truly need this next generation of farmers and ranchers and people who work the land and who are out in rural America. But we're also very proud to support people who are in the urban area as well. We know that, maybe you had to leave, the rural setting to come to the city to get a job. But who doesn't want to go back? We all want to have our place out in the country, whether we go fishing or hunting or go back and raise cattle. It's something that everyone can have, and it may not be something that everyone knows that they can have. I absolutely love working for Lone Star Ag Credit because our mission is to help people finance their pizza Texas, and that's what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so we certainly want to thank Lone Star Ag Credit for their continued support of the Ranching 101 program, no matter what format it's in these days. And we sure appreciate all of you. We had 400 people register for this session, and we could not be more happy about that, and that we're able to still bring you content that you clearly are interested in having. And so it's a true pleasure as a staff member of TSCRA that we're able to continue to serve you as members during this time. We're ready, of course, to get back on the road to some of our face-to-face events, but certainly glad that we're able to add this, and the response to some of our online content has been overwhelming. Therefore, I think you can expect to continue to see some of that out of us, even once the world gets opened back up. So I really want to thank our speakers for taking the time to do this program and making that pivot to delivering these presentations online instead of in person. I know it's different. It's certainly a different dynamic to be behind a computer and not being able to look people in the eye and gauge reactions and all of that. So it's no small thing that all of our speakers have done to make that pivot. And so I just want to say thank you. We have two folks from the Noble Research Institute with us today, and they always put together great programs. So really excited to have them. Again, if you have questions, drop those in the question and answer box or in the chat box, and we'll be able to answer some questions at the end of the program. But again, happy to have you all here today. Our speakers today are from Noble Research Institute, and our first speaker is Jeff Goodwin. He's Conservation Stewardship Leader and Senior Pasture and Range Consultant. And then our second speaker will be Brian Hayes, Pasture and Range Consultant. And again, so happy to have them both with us today. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Jeff, because that's what y'all are here to hear about.
Thanks, Stacy. I appreciate that. Let me get my screen shared here. Everybody wants to look at some good Red Angus cows, right? All right. So ideally, we would be in person, right? We'd be in person at Cattle Raisers headquarters, and we'd be talking about some of these interesting topics. But then again, we're in interesting times. So we'll switch gears here. We'll adapt. We'll overcome, and we'll move on down the road. That's what we do in the industry, right? So today we'll sort of wanted to talk about how we when we start to begin to talk about planning, when we start working about starting to integrate a ranch management plan. Where do we start? We're going to start with what I feel like is the foundation of our enterprise. It's the foundation of really any beef cattle enterprise, whether or not you're you've got a cow-calf operation in Graham, Texas, or in Hebronville, or running yearlings in Wichita. It doesn't matter. The soil is the foundation of your enterprise. And so as we move forward, I kind of like to talk about, we're coming into spring. Everything is greening up. Now is a critical time to start to understand how all of these complexities are starting to come to head. We're coming out of winter. Some of us have struggled through this past winter. And it was a little tougher on us than normal, but we're certainly welcoming spring. And so when we look at a picture like this, I like to ask people, what do you see, right? Typically we get the answer that, well, I see black cows and grass. Well, when we start to compartmentalize a picture like this and understand sort of what's really going on is, yes, we have a beef cattle enterprise. We've also got a forage enterprise there. We're growing grass. That's the foundation or it's the real thing that's moving our cattle enterprise forward. But what's foundational to all of that is the soil resource. And what you don't see going on there is these dynamic ecological systems. There are multiple ecological cycles, and they're all competing for balance. So what I'm seeing is the nitrogen cycle. I'm seeing the carbon cycle, the water cycle. All these cycles are functioning. We can't see them, but they're happening. So it's a very complex system. When we start to put things together, we often hear real simple answers. And it reminds me of this quote by Mencken that said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. I think that happens too often when we start to look at the complexities of the operations that we're managing. Somebody will just say, well, just add nitrogen, or just monitor your pH, or just fix X and everything will be okay. Well, it's not to say that variable isn't out of balance. It certainly might be, but it's never really one thing that makes or breaks us. It's the functioning of an entire cycle. So what we're here to talk about today is really that soil system and how that soil system drives the health of your enterprise. We know that it drives it. If the soil is not functioning accurately, then many of those other systems we just talked about aren't functioning accurately. The health of the soil is really not that different from human health. When you think about it, if our circulatory system is not working right, we're not working right, or our respiratory system. If the soil system is not functioning at its proper capacity, then we're going to see, we have metrics to monitor to be able to know when those systems aren't functioning at their highest capacity. So let's just start with what we know. We know that healthy soil matters. It matters to our resources. It matters to our operations. It matters to the profitability and the sustainability of our operations. Who else does it matter to? It should matter to these folks. It should matter to a growing urban public. This is an old picture. It's not from this month, right? We're not social distancing here, but you get the picture. Soils matter to the people that are consuming our products. I think our founder said it well in the early 40s when he said, Lloyd Noble said, no civilization has outlived the usefulness of its soils. When the soil is destroyed, the nation is gone. And you know that Mr. Noble said that quote in 1945, and I believe it's just as true today as it was then. We also know that people care about where their food comes from. If they didn't, then it wouldn't be filling up our social media pages. So they're beginning to more and more understand this connection, this nexus between where their food comes from and the resource and the producers that are producing that. And so understanding the basis of that system, the soil resource, is very important. So here's where we start to talk about a little bit of the downward turn of the treble. When we start to look at the condition of our soils, and it's across the country, it's across the globe, it's not just in Texas. This is a recent it's a recent report from the FAO, the UN FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. It was put out in 2015, so about 5 years ago. It was a status of the world's soil resource, and they found that an overwhelming condition or conclusion from the report was that the majority of the soil's resources were fair, poor, or in very poor condition. And typically that comes back from how we manage that soil resource. Our direct impacts have implications on how well how healthy our soils are. We start to see in the media things like scientists calling for increasing soil carbon for climate change, putting soil carbon back into the soils to meet the Paris climate pledges. We see quotes like this: humanity loses another 3/10 of our global food production capacity every year to soil erosion and degradation. That was said in that same report, but that picture is pretty common, and most of us can find a place in our county where they can find an instance that looks very, very similar to that. 3/10 of a percentage per year. That means basically every 3 to 4 years, essentially 3 years, we're losing 1% of our global capacity to feed ourselves. That's not a good trajectory to be on. The good thing is there is a way to fix it. And just to prove to you that this is not this is certainly not a Texas phenomenon. It's not even a United States phenomenon. This is a map of the global distribution of cropping and grazing ground from 2010, where they modeled soil organic carbon change in the top 2 meters of the soil. So what you're basically seeing is this histogram here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this histogram here, basically the red in the shading is the greater loss of soil carbon over that period, and the blue is a gain. So I'm seeing a whole lot more red and yellow than I am blue. So we're losing soil carbon at a rate on these sites. And what we want to do is turn that map more of a blue color, so that we're gaining soil organic matter, we're gaining our capacity to be productive with our soils, and we're regenerating those soils at a much faster rate. We certainly can do that, and there are processes and pathways for us to do that. We know that there are practices, for instance, on the left side of this screen that tend to provide negative impacts on our soils, things like tillage, things like increasing bare ground and removing all the vegetative cover. But we also know that there's sustainable or regenerative type practices, things like no-till management, adaptive multi-paddock planned grazing, a number of practices that we know that have positive impacts on soil organic matter. I think interestingly enough, we hear that word a lot: soil carbon, soil organic matter. We know that when we talk about the actual system of soils and plants and how they interact, carbon is largely the driver, right? And so we all learned about photosynthesis in grade school. And we learned that a plant can convert sunlight energy and convert that through the process of photosynthesis into simple sugars and starches, or carbohydrates. And so those simple sugars and starches are essentially the carbon that's being built in the soil. And that carbon, those sugars and starches, are food for the plant, but they're also food for a lot of other microorganisms in the soil. And those excess sugars and metabolites and amino acids are leaked out of that plant's roots. And so as that plant leaks the roots out, the biology, the bacteria, the fungi, all have symbiotic relationships where they utilize those sugars that are being produced by the plant. And so that's how we're building most of the soil carbon in the ground. It's by the roots of the plants and by the biology in the soil. It's not necessarily from the decomposition of plant material being decomposed on top. Most of it is built underground. And so when we talk about having roots in the ground, we talk about where carbon is on our planet. Most of the time when we think about carbon, we think about CO2, right? CO2 is in the atmosphere. There's carbon in our terrestrial vegetation. But when we think about it, when we actually start to look at where the carbon is on planet Earth, most of it is in the top 3 feet of the soil's crust. There's more organic carbon in the top 1 meter of our soil than in all the vegetation and the atmosphere combined. And so where do we have the greatest impact as ranchers? On the top 3 feet of the Earth's crust, right? So we play a key role on not only increasing organic matter and the capacity building of our soils, but also climate change. We are we are not the problem. We're the only sector in that pie that has the opportunity to be a sink. So we have a tremendous opportunity ahead of us to play a key role in that process. We look at rangelands. Rangelands cover nearly half of the Earth's surface. And when we talk about ranching in Texas, a very significant amount of that is on our native rangeland system. So when you're talking about 20% of the total global soil organic carbon is on rangelands, we're storing a tremendous amount. And so when we talk about soils and we start to understand, begin to understand how they come together, soils are really broken up into 3 categorical parts. Really, we've got our structure, which is the physical characteristics of soil. What is the texture? How is it aggregated? Those sorts of things we have a pretty good understanding about. There's also the chemical components in the soil. We've been also pretty good at developing testing strategies to be able to test for deficiencies in certain nutrients. What we haven't been so successful at is understanding the biological component and really what that biological interaction is between the soils and those chemicals and the plants, and how biology can even affect soil structure. And it certainly can. It certainly aids in the soil's ability to aggregate, hold water together, and increase its capacity to hold water longer. From a chemical perspective, these are some rule of thumbs that I tend to go with for organic matter, and this is for our area in I would say north central Texas to southern central Oklahoma. If we can get our organic matter to 2.5%, we're doing pretty good. On phosphorus, these are the kind of numbers. If they don't reach at least 40 pounds per acre of phosphorus or 20 parts per million, on your soil test, they're going to recommend that you add some to meet this minimum. These are the minimum requirements. So on potassium, you're going to be looking for about 125 parts per million of potassium, or there's going to be a recommendation for you to add some. Nitrogen's always based on crop requirement on most of those standard soil tests. So if you say it's Bermuda grass, they're going to ask you how many tons, and they'll provide you a recommendation on based on your specific yield goal for the crop. From the biological perspective, that's where we probably need to understand a little bit more. Again, I think we're pretty good and we have a pretty solid understanding of the chemical components, how they interact with yield. But what we don't understand is that biology. And when I mean biology, I'm talking about the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, the bacteria, algae, earthworms, all of those things. And we say that sort of word micro, and you think, man, they're really small. Yes, they are. You can't see them, but there's so many of them. They make up a tremendous amount of the biomass in these soils. So for instance, the fungi in a very healthy topsoil slice of 1 acre of a very functional prairie soil can have 9,760 pounds of biomass of just fungi in that soil. Almost 6,000 pounds per acre of soil bacteria. Millions in the palm of your hand. If you were to take a cup of soil, millions and millions of different bacteria. So just to put that into a context that we can sort of relate to, that's 27,000 pounds per acre of biology underneath the soil. If we were to relate that to animal units, that's about 22 animal units per acre. So that's a pretty heavy stocking rate. So when you hear people talk about feeding the underground herd, this is exactly what they're talking about. We've got to increase the the functionality of the biology, and there's ways that we can do that, and we're going to go through those methods. So when we talk about it's organic matter, I think it's important to understand how it sort of comes into context. So organic matter it's a funny thing, and then I'll talk about how we build it in a minute, but think of organic matter as the house for the soil bacteria, and soil organic carbon is the food source. Does that make sense? So organic matter is basically roughly 58% soil organic carbon. So not all of the organic matter is soil organic carbon. About 58% of it is. It's that active fraction of the soil organic carbon that is actively feeding the microbes, okay? And so there's lots of different pools of organic matter in the soil, and some are more labile than others, some are more steady, but it's that active fraction of organic carbon that's feeding the biology. And a lot of that is carbon coming right out of the roots of the plants, those metabolites, and in liquid form. This biology functions in a liquid state. There's ways to test for this. The Haney test is out. You can get that through Ward Labs or a number of testing commercial labs. It does provide a soil health score. It provides water extractable organic carbon too, which is a more specific representation of that water extractable fraction of organic carbon, or that active fraction that the biology is using. It does provide a CO2 respiration test, a Slavita test that gives you an idea of the activity level of the biology in the soil. The PLFA test is the phospholipid fatty acid test. It's a pretty good assessment of microbial biomass, like how much do you have. It gives you a pretty good ratings on bacterial and fungi ratios. The trouble with it is there's a lot of fungi that comes back as undisclosed or undiscoverable. They don't know what it is. So you might have 40% of the constituents that are undiscovered. And I'm not sure that's helping you very much at $80 a test. The Cornell test is pretty comprehensive. It's $110 a sample, and you probably ought to be pretty deep into this before you get into that assessment. But it's very comprehensive and very good. If I was going to recommend one for someone starting out into the soil health area, I would start with the Haney test. And I would start it on very specific areas of my ranch that I wanted to monitor, not the whole ranch. So if carbon is the primary fuel source, then what's driving the carbon? I think it's important to understand and contextualize how we understand how carbon works within our larger system. Carbon is not this linear plane that just builds over time. It's cyclical. And it's on rangeland specifically, it's driven by climatic variation. But management, how we manage that landscape can have can determine the extent of the loss, if you will. So what I mean by that is here's a bit of data from from Noble Research Institute, looking at 15 years on some of our forage systems. And here we're looking at soil organic matter over in a number of treatments. And what I'm seeing here starting in 2014 is we're building organic matter. We're building, and then something walks into the room and hits us all over the head with a bat, and we all drop. And then we build, and it hits us again. And then we build, and it hits us again. So my question is, what happened in Texas in 2011? A drought. Even floods have pretty solid impacts on soil organic matter. Droughts probably more commonly than flooding, but our data suggests that flooding negatively impacted organic matter as well. And so the point here is that we can mitigate and manage through those times, but we can't control for them. You can't control drought, you can't control flooding. So what we have to do is control what we can and manage for those outcomes that we want. Not necessarily how this young lady does her management planning, but the point, the takeaway here is that we're not going to change the drought and the flood. They're going to come. But what we can do is minimize and mitigate the negative impacts of those when they do arise, and they're on their way. So moving into some of the ways that we can solve some of these ecological problems, I like to say often that we address these ecological problems and we solve them with principled actions or principles, not just practices. So for instance, cover crops. You hear the word cover crops all the time. If you go out and plant cover crops and then you cut it for silage, are you building healthy soil? Well, I planted cover crops. I implemented one of the practices, but I didn't manage it based on a set of principles. It's about how you manage the principles, not the practices that you apply on each acre. What do I mean by that? And so there's a set of core principles that are pretty well agreed upon in this community of regenerative agriculture. And they're largely focused loosely around the same 5 core principles. Number 1, minimize soil disturbance. Soil health cannot be built if it's moving. So if it's blowing, if it's washing, it has to be still, right? So we want to minimize soil disturbance. In this context, this was typically made for agronomic purposes, so they mean tillage. Don't disturb the soil. From a crop diversity perspective, we want to maximize diversity, move away from monocultures and more to more diverse systems. And for me, number 1 is keep the soil covered. Keeping the soil covered is my first principle, because if you don't keep the soil covered, none of the rest of these matter. Maintaining a live root in the ground is a 4th principle. We're going to talk about each of these. And then integrating livestock. Even back on our crop ground, how much crop ground do we have in the state that doesn't have a fence around it? Being able to utilize some of those acres to integrate livestock and recycle some of those nutrients back on them. So when we talk about this from a rangeland pasture context, it's really not much different. When we talk about minimizing soil disturbance, we want to optimize disturbance on rangeland. What I mean by optimized disturbance is grazing and fire are both disturbances. We don't want to remove them from rangelands. We want to optimize the timing, the intensity, the frequency, and the duration of when we apply that practice. That's how we manage the principle. We want to increase biodiversity on rangelands. We reduce bare ground when possible. We increase biodiversity to keep that living root in the ground year round, and we adaptively manage our grazing management. And so contextually, if we'll go into each of these principles, when we start to look at keeping the ground covered, why? What's the purpose? We prevent erosion, we limit the loss of evaporation, but one of the big ones for me is it mitigates soil temperature. In the summertime, that soil on the right could be 140 degrees. I don't know if you guys have cooked hamburgers lately, but that's the temperature you cook a hamburger to kill the bacteria. And so on a 105-degree day in Brackettville, Texas, or in Childress, that soil can be 140 or darn close to it. And if you do that, we're killing the soil bacteria, and we don't want to do that. So keeping the ground covered and shaded and thermally regulated is very important. Again, minimizing the unnatural disturbances. Those two on the bottom left and right are not unnatural. They're natural disturbances. Grazing and fire are natural. Again, we manage the timing, intensity, frequency, and duration. On the right, we've got chemical and fertility. I'm not saying they aren't tools that we can't use, but manage the timing, intensity, and duration of those. Don't just blindly put out triple 13 fertilizer every year because that's what we do. Take a soil test. Manage towards an intentional goal. Increase biodiversity. We know that if we increase the number of plants, we also increase the microbial biomass in our soils. We also increase the respiration or the activity of those microbial constituents in the soil, like soil bacteria. So as we increase biodiversity in the number of plants, we ultimately increase the diversity of the site. Just talking briefly on rangeland, how do we increase diversity in a native rangeland planting? We can do it through grazing and fire. We've done it that way for eons, but a lot of times we get back to wanting to plant something or reclaim something on rangeland, and we get into a situation like this where we're trying to seed something. We've plowed it up and we want to seed it to a brilliant seeder, but this is not the situation. This is the typical situation we'd love to have, but this is a typical situation that we have. We've got a degraded site, and it's either an old cotton field, or it's an old cropland field, or it's a site that's been degraded that you've purchased or have control over now, and you want to reclaim it. And so when you talk to the experts, we're told what we want to plant. So they go out and they plant the big five, right? Our big four: Indian grass, switchgrass, big blue stem, little blue stem. And then when it doesn't work in 4 years, we blame it on the rain, because we took a high cereal plant that required a sort of a high climax plant, and we wouldn't put it in a soil that wasn't ready to have it. The scientific literature is riddled with papers that talk about the relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plants like big blue stem, these high cereal tall grass species. And if that relationship is not there, then that plant might germinate, but it's not going to persist. So you probably won't ever see it. And so the way we get around some of that is we grow the biology first. We consider double cropping for the first couple of years. You can graze that. You can get some financial return on an investment, or you can add more mid-cereal species to help that community come along a little bit faster. But going out and just planting these high cereal plants in a very degraded soil and expecting it to work is you're destined to be unsatisfied with that. Increasing diversity on pasture, on Bermuda grass. We can do that by interseeding. This is just a brief example of what we did on our ranch there in Marietta, Oklahoma, where we interseeded about 11 species. We planted at a 50-pound seeding rate and interseeded in the fall. We did put 30 pounds of NROP just to increase seedling germination. That's 3,500 pounds of dry matter production of highly diverse annuals on top of Bermuda grass. And so we were able to graze that with a set of first calf heifers. We grazed through that based on utilization. And we got about 30 to 45 additional days of grazing that year before the Bermuda grass greened up, about right now. Number 4, working through this is living roots. You got to keep a living root in the ground year round. Ideally, we would like to see that biology wants to use the active carbon first, and that active carbon is the root exudates from the plants. And so we want that action happening year round. And to do that, you've got to have cool and warm season plants. You've got to have broad leaves and grasses, because each of those plants put out different types of metabolites and sugars. One plant can put out up to 135 different metabolites. So the more plants that you have, the greater diversity in an offering, the greater diversity you'll build in your microbial constituents. Lastly, proper livestock integration. Again, that adaptive grazing. Planning is going to be required here. Brian's going to get into some of the stocking rate issues, so I won't go into that. But the key here is managing and manipulating your stocking rate to matching your carrying capacity, and really understand the key role that stock density can play in increasing your ecological benefits. So to do that, we want to increase, if you want to increase those ecological outcomes the fastest, we try to bunch cattle in as much as we can. Typically, I like to say, put the highest amount of cattle on the smallest amount of land for the shortest amount of time. What that does is increase your impact. You increase the distribution of urine and manure. You also are providing rest to the other acres that aren't being grazed at that time. So you're increasing the amount of rest that you're providing the other pastures that you're not on. But if that's too intensive for you, there's a lot of power in one wire. Shut the gate, watching and managing just the residual stubble heights will get you down the road faster than continuous grazing will. A couple of, just in summary now, sort of some field indicators that anybody on anywhere in the planet can go out and look at. Take a shovel, go out and dig about 6 inches down and look at things like soil color. Soil color is highly correlated with organic matter. The darker the color, typically the more organic matter that you have. Soil structure is also keenly important. The greater your soil has the ability to hold these aggregates together, when that organic matter and the soil biology aid in forming these soil glues, they form these aggregates. And when these aggregates begin to form together, they increase the space between them. Not only do they have the ability to hold more water, they also infiltrate more water because they are increasing the pore space in the soil. Also look for biological activity. You're not necessarily, you can look for earthworms. That's also a key indicator, but you can see castings, you can see holes, you can see activity, and that's often a good indicator. Again, rooting resistance is also important. We don't want to see any kind of J-rooting. J-rooting is where a plant root comes down, hits a restrictive layer, and then turns. We don't want to see any of that, because that restrictive layer, if it's turning roots, can often turn water, and you could be basically creating your own drought. And then soil smell. It's not really a physical characteristic, but it is olfactory or sensory. The biology in the soil, the bacteria specifically, put off a organic compound called geosmin. And that's a chemical compound that you can smell. Another chemical compound, biocompound put off by soil bacteria is this smell, this musky smell after a rain. That's also a chemical, I guess a biochemical compound that you can smell that comes from the soil bacteria. And so as we start to understand some of these things, we start to put and contextualize it all and begin to understand it. I would encourage you to put some kind of a plan together with your pastors. If you want something like this, you can download this calculator at our website. This is just a way for you to say, okay, I'm going to monitor my physical, chemical, and biological characteristics on this month, on these years. It's just a way for you to put together a plan. And then you can sort of use soil assessment cards like this. These are some of the key indicators that I look for under physical, chemical, and soil health criteria. You can provide the rating and the date, and then just monitor that over time as you begin to go down this path of soil health. I talked a little too long. I'm going to stop and turn it over to Brian right now, and I think we're going to take questions at the end. So Brian, I'm going to stop sharing, and it's all yours.
Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, sir.
All right. Get mine shared here. All right. Well, thank y'all. Glad to be here with you today. If I can get my PowerPoint started here. As Jeff said, my name's Brian Hayes, and I'm also a range and pasture consultant at Noble. And good talk there, Jeff. And as Jeff alluded to, when Jeff and I sat back, I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago, and decided trying to write a little news and views article on some things we thought would be good for producers to monitor and to think about at this time of the year on native rangelands. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about those today. And Jeff mentioned we'll be talking a little bit on stocking rates, precipitation, monitoring your utilization of your pastures, and then monitoring for invasives. And if we talk about a stocking rate, and Jeff mentioned this as well, a stocking rate is a measure of your forage demand. So how much do the livestock need? How much do they need, or is there demand for that forage? And carrying capacity is the measure of forage that is available, or the supply that's available there. And we always say, you don't set it and forget it when you're stocking rate. It's something you got to evaluate through the year and adjust as necessary. And if we look at overstocking, it is a result of less than optimal management of the forage resource. It may be that you're staying in a pasture too long, or you're coming back to a pasture too fast and not letting it rest and recover. Or you could have too many cattle, or it could be both. So how do we go about how do you know if you are overstocked? One thing that we do, that we work with producers on, is just looking at, if you look at your rainfall and you're basing your stocking rate or your forage supply off of annual rainfall, if we look at this as the long-term precipitation for a Northeast Oklahoma site through our mesonet that we have here in Oklahoma, and normal is 39.3 inches of rain a year. So if you stack it, if you set your stocking rate based on that average rainfall amount in the forage production that's forecasted to produce, you're overstocked 50% of the time. If that makes sense. So those years when we're in the valleys here in the brown, you're going to be overstocked because we're not getting the rainfall to produce that forage or that supply. If you're stocked at 90% of that average rainfall, you'd be overstocked 1 in every 3 to 4 years. And if you stock at 80% of your average rainfall, you're overstocked 1 in 8 years. So we tend to stock conservatively. It gives us a little more flexibility. One thing I wanted to mention, that we went back and looked at 100 years of average rainfall for southern Oklahoma here in Ardmore. And out of 11 years out of 100, we were within 1 inch plus or minus of the long-term average. So it's a good tool to use to go back and look at your rainfall and monitor that. And oftentimes I ask folks when I can see you in person, how many people have a rain gauge? Just 100% hands go up. How many of you write it down when you get that rain? And a lot of them drop. But it's one of the things that you can really use that can help you manage and forecast going through the year on what your productivity will likely be like. So we usually tend to set conservative stocking rates that provide flexibility and opportunities and risk management. So if we set that stocking rate at 80% of what we think it could be in a normal year, and we have an above average year, then that gives us the opportunity, if we wanted to run some stockers, or if we had a set of cows that came available that we thought were good, we've got the forage there to take them on. It just gives you that flexibility to in your operation where you're not right there on the edge waiting for the next drought. So some key strategy is to set and adapt stocking rates to rainfall and inputs. You want it to be a conservative, elastic stocking rate, estimated using a scientific-based method. Several there, just to throw out some ideas. I don't know if some of you have heard of the Web Soil Survey that's available through USDA. If you haven't, just Google Web Soil Survey and you can go to their site and there's a big green button. You can say start and you go find your property. You can outline it and download what forage production would be in a favorable year, a normal year, or an unfavorable year. And it'll give you, based on the soils that are on your property, for each of those soil classes, it'll give you a production pounds per acre of what it has the potential to produce. So that's one way to start. Another is you can clip plots if you like to do that, and we can talk about that here in a little bit if we want to. So one thing that we use here at Noble, and you can download this, is similar to the Jeff's soil scorecard that he mentioned earlier. Over there to the right, you can download this at that web address there. And what this does is just a water year table, and we look at it starting in October is the start of our water year, going into the dormant season, and then coming into the spring. What we really look at, and I think y'all can see my pointer, and this is back from Ardmore, Oklahoma. We want to look at what's the variance from long-term average. So in October, November, December, December we were -1. We can tell you though, coming in January, February, and March, Jeff and I went back and looked. So if we look at October of 2019 here in Ardmore through April 1st of 2020, Ardmore Station has received 24.3 inches of rain. That's 6.2 inches more than normal during that time on average. Or to say it another way, we're 138% above what we normally get. So this is, and it's currently the 10th wettest record for this time period since 1921. So we're coming into spring and the growing season with good soil moisture. And as Jeff alluded to in his presentation, if we're keeping that soil covered during the year and we're trying to promote our soil health and organic matter, we've caught a lot of rain. We've got a lot of rain stored up to help grow some forage going into the growing season. But this is a tool you can download. I don't believe Texas has a Mesonet like we do here in Oklahoma. Each county has at least one station that's recorded, and you can download that information, put it right in the spreadsheet. But you can go to your NOAA website and get the station in your county that's closest to your ranch and monitor and load that into the spreadsheet. It'll give you an opportunity to monitor and see where you are as you go through the year and adjust as necessary. Some of the other information we want to talk about a little bit is just monitoring utilization. Several ways to do that. One is by using a grazing stick. And if y'all didn't know Jeff, that's a picture of Jeff with his grazing stick there. Good tool to use, good handy. Most everybody's got a yardstick. We call them a grazing stick, but you can use those to, what we like to recommend to producers to do is before you're going to turn into a pasture, you can pick sites out there that are uniform, that are representative of the pasture you're going into. You don't want to pick an area that's maybe eroded or right next to the water source, but something that is uniform with that pasture, represent that pasture well. And then pick a plant that you're interested in and monitor that. So like in this photo here where you see Jeff's measuring, that's a little blue stem, trying to see how much has been grazed. And then when you start seeing that utilization where you're getting the utilization you want on those plants, then you know you're getting close to time to move into the next pasture to give this a chance to recover before you come back to graze it again. Just some rules of thumb, if you will. Tall grasses like the little blue stem, big blue stem, and switchgrass, I always usually say maintain 10, 12 inches, boot top height. Your mid grasses like silver blue stem, side oak, Texas cup grass, maybe that 6 to 8 inch range. And then on your short grasses, 3 to 4 inches. And again, as Jeff said, make sure we keep the ground covered and keep those plants healthy so that they can continue to produce well for us into the future. One that we often use too are grazing exclusion cages. I like these because you can put them out there again in a representative place in a pasture. You have those out, make them big enough where you can clip plots during the growing season, because usually, if you've got 2 cattle panels, you can clip them big, have them big enough to where you can clip 4 1-meter squared plots inside there. Another good benefit of these is if you get the cattle panels that have the 4-inch squares, then you can kind of look, if you look back, we said 8 to 12 inches on your stubble height, the residue height on those tall grasses. And if that's what you've got, then you can kind of look, like the side oats here, you can get it down 4 to 6 to 8 inch range. It gives you a visual there to use those. And again, then you can clip plots inside these during the year. So for Southern Great Plains, usually by the end of May, so by the end of next month, in our native pastures, we're going to have 50% of the production for the year. So that would probably be a good time to clip there at May. Clip one plot in there, weigh it, and figure out your pounds per acre, and see how that jives with your stocking rate, and adjust if you need to. And then usually by the end of June, first part of July, in the Southern Great Plains and our native plant communities, we're at 70 to 75% of our production. Might be another good time to clip. And then again, after first frost, then we know what our yearly production was for that. Just some key rules of thumb with the grazing exclusion cages. Again, they give you timely and intuitive information on grazing use that then you can use to make adjustments as you're going through your grazing plan. I mentioned cage size. If you can make them big enough where you put them on a representative site and make them big enough where you can clip them during the year to see how your production is going. When we talked about where to place them, what to observe, you can just use them as a visual cue to monitor the cages periodically to determine grazing utilization and make your moves based off of that. And then you can compare the monthly or seasonal forage production to forecasted production to make timely decisions to balance that forage production and animal demand. And then move them to a different location in the winter for the next year if you decide to use these. Another one that we use quite a bit are photo points. And these are just to get a fixed location in your pastures. You might have a T-post that you shoot off of and that's always back in the camera, or a big oak tree, something that you can line up and keep going to the same place. Do these throughout the year. These pictures here show a property where you can see on the far left in the fall, year 1 had a lot of juniper encroachment. They started working on that winter year 2, then the spring of year 3, and then summer of year 5. You can see that transition in this pasture. Based off the woody plant encroachment management that they were doing, their brush management. One thing you can do as well, if you're interested in particularly like Jeff said, keeping the ground covered at all times, you can take these landscape photos like this, but if you have that photo point where you're standing, you can look down and take a picture as well to see what does it look like from above. And you might have a little transect you walk and take a picture every 4 or 5 steps and just kind of see how your ground cover is being maintained through your management practices. And you can take these quarterly. But sure, I think a good opportunity is to take them as you're learning. If you're just getting into rotational grazing, moving pastures, take a picture before you go in. Then when you come out and kind of measure that, as we mentioned with a grazing stick, get your eye tuned to that so that you know when to make those timely moves. Another one we hear sometimes, I know Jeff would tell me, if you don't have to stockpile if your stocking rate set correctly and you're rotating through your pastures. But sometimes a lot of the producers we work with here in North Texas and Southern Oklahoma also have introduced pastures like Bermuda grass. So what we normally, when we're working with a producer like that, we would encourage them to graze their native pastures up until end of June. When we'd have about 70% of our production for the year, and then stay off of the native, let it have the rest of the year to grow and get the carbohydrates back in the root system and graze it as stockpile hay after the first frost. A lot of our producers up here in this area as well do winter burns and summer burns. So stockpiling is a good opportunity for you. Identify those pastures now that you want to stockpile and monitor those so that you can have the vegetation for fuel there this winter or next summer if you're going to do a growing season burn. Another good thing to be looking at right now, and what they probably already have in most parts where we are, is mesquite bud break. So that's always a good one up in April, March, April, to look for that. That usually occurs once we get the soil temperature between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And why that is important, because if you're going to aerial spray or aerial treat foliar treat mesquite, the prime time to do that is usually 45 days after bud break, when that plant is, the physiology is actually sending carbohydrates back down to the root system. So you've got good mature leaves on there, and you generally have a 45-day window after that as well. And then you'll want your soil temperatures at 12 inches deep at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit as well when you do that treatment. And then also, and again, this is for rangeland, but now is a good time too for if you do have introduced pasture, to be doing your soil samples, as Jeff said, and getting your soil fertilizer out between April 15th and May 15th, and also scouting for invasives or for weedy plants that you may not want in your Bermuda grass. Now's the time to be doing that too. With that, summer will be here before we know it, so we got to be sure and manage our residuals on our plant species. Make sure that we've got keeping that good residuals on our native plants so that they'll continue to produce for us going into the future. Monitor your water year table. I would encourage y'all, if you get an opportunity, to download that. And if you have trouble or have issues with that, Jeff or I, either one, to be able to work with you on that. But I think it's a really good tool that allows you to make timely management decisions and let you know when you might be going into a drought before you would normally. Now it's getting ready, good time to start getting ready to treat invasive species if you've got them. And it's always a good time to be monitoring our plant resources as we're going through the growing season and through the summer months. With that, I was just going to stab for a program Jeff and I'll have up here. And as of right now, we're still set for June the 2nd at our coffee ranch here in southern Oklahoma. If you're interested in that, we can get you information on that as well. And if you're interested in following Noble, there's some of our internet resources. You feel free to join in there and follow us and send us questions or call us with any issues you may have. Jeff and I'd be more than happy to work with y'all at any time. Jeff, anything you'd like to add or?
No, I think we're good. We do have a few questions. Stacy, I don't know if you want to read through those or if you want us to, however you want to do it.
It's up to you. A couple of questions are related to the slides. The recording and along with the video will be available. I don't know if y'all are willing to share your actual slides, but you will have access to the recorded presentation, and that automated email will go out tomorrow. So some questions.
I'm happy to provide a PDF of the slides if you have some place to post it where they can get access to it.
Okay, yes. So if you will, I can post them, and then I can also send that link out with the recording.
Okay.
Jeff, do you see these or do you want to?
Yeah, I can read through them if you want me to.
Okay, that might be easier.
Yeah, so Marcus asked, how do we take a Haney test? Is it similar to doing soil tests, and how do we send the samples in for testing? The Haney test is no different from a typical soil test that you might go and take. Just make sure that when you take the test, typically we'll take a test at 0 to 6 inches. That's the general, that's the depth that most of the testing are calibrated to. And so get a push probe, a soil probe, and take representative samples across your field, and then aggregate those samples in a bucket, mix it up, and take a subsample out of that to send to the lab. If you don't have a soil probe, just use a sharpshooter or something. Dig a 6-inch slice back, dig about a 1-inch slice out of that. Again, aggregate several of those representatively around the site, around the pasture, aggregate that up, take a subsample out of that and send it to the lab. Where to do it? We use Ward Labs. Ward Labs does a real good job for us. You can just Google Ward Labs. They have a lot of really good written material on the Haney test. The Haney test was developed by Dr. Rick Haney out of Temple, Texas. He works for the Ag Research Service there. Brilliant scientist developed this process for looking at these soil health metrics. and it's a really cool test. This next question was from Tom Voss. Said he's recently acquired some land and has some area that looked like the red clay overgrazed with very little plant life, lots of erosion on a hill. In addition to soil testing, what's the first step to restore that pasture? You're gonna have to get some organic matter back on it. And I would start with a lot of times when we find those either washout area or an area that's become sort of denuded or whatever, feed hay on it. If you're gonna feed any hay, find those areas that don't have any that are low in plant vigor or bare ground. Feed on those areas. Not only do you get the animal impact, you get the increased organic matter, and that's what you've got to do on those sites to get them started. So roll out some hay, feed it on it. If you don't want Bermuda grass, find some other kind of hay. Get some sorghum hay or whatever that you can get access to. If you can find some, if it's in a native field and you can find some prairie hay, do that. But outside of that, it's going to take organic matter. It's going to take time. Those are the two things that are going to fix that spot. Let's see. Brian, here's a question for you. It says, if you stock at 80% stocking rates, how do you get cattle to eat the less desirable grass? You're on mute, Brian.
Okay, I'm on mute. Sorry about that. What was the question, Jeff? I was looking for it.
If you stock at 80% stocking rates, how do you get cattle to eat the less desirable grass?
I think one way you can do that is what you mentioned, is that high stock density, where you get them in there and put them in a smaller, put it in one herd and get them in a smaller spot. It's just like me and Jeff and a busload of people going to the pizza buffet. We're all going to grab what we can grab. And that's one way you can get them to utilize that a little bit better, is by doing some of that high stock density grazing. Anything to add, Jeff?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Typically, when you have a lower stock density, you're going to have spot grazing, because the cow is determining the grass they're going to eat at that point, and it's not you managing the grass that you have. So if you can increase the density, if you're not increasing the stocking rate. Now, the stocking rate is, let's just say you've got 100 cows. You're stocked at a cow per 20 acres. You're not increasing the stocking rate. You're just taking that herd of cattle and putting them on a smaller parcel of land for a shorter period of time. Now, you got to watch animal performance, because in certain times when you do that, animal performance can drop, but it can also increase during times of year like now. So stock density would be one way to watch to mitigate that.
Yes.
I think the rest of the questions are about.
Some slides.
One question came in the Zoom side that asked about a warm season mix that without danger of prussic acid poisoning, and I'm assuming they're talking about a warm season cover crop mix. We can certainly help people develop those mixes. We do that all the time. You're going to have to exclude the sorghums. So any of the, you can replace those with millets. There's 3 or 4 millets that we like to use. They're not going to be quite as productive, but you won't have the sorghum prussic acid issues that are associated with the sorghum plants. So that's just, that's sort of the if you're interested, you can send either Brian or myself an email. My email's posted there, and we can get those things done. Here's another question. Brian, what is the overstocking in my area website that is referenced? It says, what is the overstocking in my area website that was referenced earlier? I believe it was just before the water year table.
I mentioned Web Soil Survey.
Yeah, you might just briefly discuss that and how you can assess your production variables, but and tell them why to be cautious about that.
Yeah, I mean, just to mention again, a Web Soil Survey, and I'll type that in here in a minute when I'm done visiting about it. But it's a good resource that's available through USDA. It's the Web Soil Survey, pretty user-friendly. If not, like I said, Jeff or I can walk you through it, or your local NRCS office can for sure walk you through it. It's a good tool that allow you to go in. You can look at you can outline your property and download the soils. And then from that, you can download ecological sites if those are available. Sometimes some counties have them, some don't, but for sure you can download, if you're a native pasture, you can download what production for those soil types on your property are in a favorable year. So in a above normal rainfall year, an average year or a normal year, and then a below normal year or an unfavorable year. We use those quite a bit as just a starting point. Before we go out and work with producers, we can find out where the property is. We'll hop on Web Soil Survey, download the soils and the production estimates that are available through that website, and then evaluate when we get there. But it does give you a good starting point. If you're Bermuda grass and those two, or Old World blue stems, you can look at those as well. They'll give you some production estimates for that as well. So it's just a good starting point. If you're not sure how much production you have on your property, it gives you an opportunity to look at that. One thing we didn't mention that I failed to mention in there is anytime we're setting our stocking rate as well, we need to be looking at grazable acres. So we need to take out any areas that are covered in brush and roads and ponds and working facilities and things like that come out of that acreage that's grazable. Anything else, Jeff, do you want to add?
I think that's good. Just keep in mind that's a starting point. It's a starting point for where to move, how to move forward. And just be careful, it's not the gospel. It doesn't take into account any kind of grazing history or grazable acres. It just says what's the soil's capability in a normal year of production.
Correct.
I think that's all the questions, Stacy.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much, guys. This was a lot of good information that that you gave us in a short amount of time. So y'all be sure and go back and watch that the recording, and then we'll be able to get the slides from the speakers as well. So that email will go out to everybody tomorrow with the links to the PDF as well as the recording. So again, thank you, Jeff and Brian, for your time today. Really, really well done. And thank you all for being on. And tomorrow, if you want some more information, tomorrow we're going to have a program that was going to be presented during the Cattle Raisers Convention and Expo that was rescheduled. And so that will be a calving demonstration along with some calving techniques with Dr. Joe Pascal and Dr. Tom Haregrove with Texas A&M. So always a really popular demonstration that we do, and we're going to try to do that online. So that is on our website at tscra.org, and where to go in and register for that. And then we've been doing weekly market updates with kind of the impact of the COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on the cattle markets. We've been doing those updates weekly. So we'll do that on Friday at 2 p.m. With Justin Benavides at Texas A&M University as well. And we will continue those market updates for you. We're also going to be rolling out more and more of the School for Successful Ranching programs that we weren't able to have in March, just to kind of build a library of content, as well as give you some opportunities to learn from the comfort of your home right now. So be sure and doing that. Be sure and join us for those other events. And again, thank you all for being on, and have a great Tuesday.
Stacy.
Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Y'all too.